president of ASN MicroS student chapter, we will be the moderators of the roundtable discussion entitled SARS-CoV-2 Vaccines Educational Statements, for which we have expert doctors in such area, whom we thank for their participation and for all the knowledge that they will be sharing with us tonight. To begin, we want to introduce them. So, Dr. Robin Patel is the Elizabeth P. and Robert E. Allen Professor of Individualized Medicine, Professor of Medicine, Professor of Microbiology, Director of the Infectious Disease Research Laboratory, and co-director of the Clinical Bacteriology Laboratory at the Mayo Clinic. She is board certified in infectious diseases, as well as medical and public health microbiology. Dr. Patel is a past president of the American Society for Microbiology, ASM, and a fellow of the American Academy of Microbiology. Dr. Patel's research is supported by the National Institutes of Health, NIH, focuses on bacterial resistance, development, and utilization of diagnostic tests and biofilms. She has published almost 500 peer-reviewed manuscripts. In addition to her positions at the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Patel has been a member of the NIH National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases Council, and is the director of the NIH Laboratory Center of the Antibacterial Resistance Leadership Group, advisor to the Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute, and an associate editor of Clinical Infectious Diseases. She is also a past chair of the U.S. Medical Licensing Examination Microbiology and Immunology Test Material Development Committee, and a current member of U.S. Medical Licensing Examination Item Review Group.
To continue, we have the participation of Dr. Brianne Barker. Dr. Brianne Barker is originally from Camden, New York. She earned her Bachelor of Science degree from Duke University, where she majored in biology and minored in chemistry and history. While at Duke, she performed research in the laboratory of Dr. Barton Haynes, examining antibody responses to HIV vaccines candidates. Dr. Barker then earned her PhD in immunology from Harvard University, where her research advisor was Dr. Norma Ledman. Her dissertation was an examination of citizens' control of CD8 plus T cell memory, and she then received her postdoctoral training in the laboratory of Dr. Jenny Ting at the University of North Carolina of Chapel Hill at the Lindenberg Comprehensive Cancer Center Department of Microbiology, Immunology, where she worked on her pattern recognition receptor signaling. Dr. Barker also started her teaching career as a visiting assistant professor at Hamilton College, and she joined the biology faculty at Drew in 2013. Also, she has assisted to multiple talks and panelists at American Society of Microbiology and has created a lot of publications. Her last one was about characterization of the innate immune response to single-strand DNA in 2020. The activity consists of a discussion with the two speakers with whom we will address the following thematic axes. First one, the vaccine efficacy in diverse populations. Second one, the vaccine coverage against different strain mutations of SARS-CoV-2. And the third one, vaccines and their side effects. We will ask questions addressed to each speaker, who will have between 5 to 10 minutes to answer. And if another speaker wants to join or give their opinion on the subject, they're going to be able to do it as well. At the end of the discussion, we will give a short space to the audience so they can ask any questions they have, or they can send us through the chat. So to start, we have vaccine efficacy in diverse populations. The potential testing of a new vaccine on human volunteers became the key steps in the journey from laboratory to clinic. Historically, clinical trials for vaccines involve different phases that have this diverse requirement. Right now, almost 200 vaccines are in phase 3, And the top vaccines that lead are Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, and last month, the reincorporation of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. In above all contexts, Dr. Barker, could you tell us if there is any specific scientific evidence about the efficacy of these vaccines on patients with immunodeficiencies?
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for that question. So this is a little bit of a tricky question, of course, because there are so many different types of immunodeficiencies and so many different types of patients with immunodeficiencies. So before I talk about the specific evidence in patients with immunodeficiencies, one thing I want to point out is related to the way these particular vaccines work. So the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, of course, are mRNA-based vaccines, where the mRNA that encodes one protein from SARS-CoV-2 is used, the spike protein. And the AstraZeneca vaccine is a recombinant adenovirus vaccine, again, where the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 is used. Additionally, Johnson & Johnson is also an adenovirus vectored vaccine, though a different adenovirus. And so in both cases, the gene encoding spike is put into another adenovirus. The COVAX vaccine, if I'm remembering correctly, is an inactivated vaccine. The reason why I mention all of this is that none of these vaccine types are replicating. And that is an important thing to point out, because oftentimes when there are issues with vaccines in immunocompromised patients, it is often something that we see with a live attenuated vaccine, where that is a vaccine that is able to reproduce in the patient. None of these vaccine types are able to reproduce in the patient. And sometimes people will ask, well, those adenovirus vaccines, that sounds like they could. But in fact, the adenoviruses are modified so that they can only deliver the nucleic acid for the spike protein, and that they are unable to reproduce further. So none of these vaccine types have the ability to reproduce, which is something that you often worry about in an immunocompromised patient. We can also think a little bit about vaccine efficacy, in addition to whether we would worry about those issues of vaccine safety. Officially, we measure vaccine efficacy by looking at how frequently the patients have disease following vaccination. And in some cases, I don't have great data on that. So one thing I can tell you is that if you look in a few of the trials, there actually were some HIV positive individuals. And so you can imagine those individuals may be immunocompromised, although the data has not been released where those individuals' specific responses are separated out. If there was a particular problem, we might think we may have heard something about it, but we have not. But again, the data has not been specifically separated out for those HIV patients. There aren't a lot of other data published on specific immunocompromised groups, although there is some data out there from transplant recipients who were on immunosuppressive medications. Here, they weren't looking at the specifics of vaccine efficacy in terms of whether those patients were protected from disease. Instead, they measured antibody levels in the patients, which they hoped would tell them if the patients were protected. And those transplant recipients did seem to make good antibody responses to the mRNA vaccines in the case of this particular study. So you could certainly imagine, given the broad number of types of immunodeficiencies or types of immunocompromising diseases that are out there, that this might vary a bit from condition to condition, but from the data that we have seen, immunocompromised patients seem to do rather well. And of course, if we think about the risk of SARS-CoV-2 infection in immunocompromised patients where they may have some severe complications, the vaccine may be is likely to be an overall benefit to them.
Yeah, if I could jump in for a minute, that was an absolutely great answer. And I think one of the things that we've learned from this pandemic, which is true of medicine in general, is that we don't have perfect answers to every question that's out there. We're learning, and I think we're, as physicians, it's first do no harm to people, but in the middle of a pandemic where bad things are happening, a virus is spreading, people are getting sick, people are dying, and we have a potential solution, a vaccine, we really need to think about what makes sense. And what you just heard is it's unlikely that there's increased harm of using a vaccine in an immunocompromised patient, and B, that the vaccines may work. And we don't have good evidence that they don't work, but we don't have a lot of evidence in these particular patients to evaluate them. To me, as a medical doctor, that means that we should use them. There's not a contraindication in an immunocompromised patient to vaccinating that patient against COVID-19. And in fact, you may think that that's a group that should have priority to get the vaccine. There are also so many different kinds of immunocompromised patients, obviously. So that's sort of a loaded question in that regard. And hopefully we'll learn more about this over time, but sometimes we don't have enough time to do the perfect science and to do the perfect study. And again, if we don't have a signal of a harmful effect and the only possible outcome is either nothing, which we don't think is the case based on, say, antibody responses, or a positive effect of vaccination, then you have to say, well, go forth and give the vaccine to immunocompromised patients.
Thank you so much for both of your responses. We all agree that new evidence is going out every day. So following with the efficacy of the in diverse populations, I would like to bring about pregnant women. Following with this thematic access on April 28th, on the current date, the information about COVID-19 vaccines for people who are pregnant or breastfeeding was published at the CDC the webpage. And of course, it mentions about pregnant women that are at an increased risk for severe illness from COVID-19 when compared with non-pregnant women, but there is still limited data about the safety of COVID-19 vaccines for people who are pregnant. So Dr. Patel, could you give us your perspective on it, or if there is a risk in the newborn, or also if the mother, since there are enough studies to conclude on that yet?
Yes, another very good question. So a population that we know is at risk, at higher risk for severe COVID-19 disease than the general population, than say at age match controls. We know that. We don't have any other tools to prevent this virus in pregnant women aside from physical distancing and not being in contact with anyone else who has this virus. And we have a vaccine that we know is going to be protective in pregnant women. I mean, we don't have a reason to believe that it's not going to work in pregnant women. So I think that sort of leaves you with that question, do we have enough data on safety in pregnant women? And to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been a safety signal in pregnant women. So the way that I weigh all of that is that you have to look at the risk of the woman contracting COVID-19 and becoming very ill versus a vaccine that doesn't have a long track record in pregnant women, doesn't have a long track record in anybody, quite frankly, but will protect against the virus. And I would come down on the side of considering vaccination in pregnant women, given that situation. I mean, there might be, case examples where you might say wait, depending on the amount of virus that's circulating in a community and where a woman is in her pregnancy, where you're assessing, risk benefit. But I would say overall that this would be a situation where I would think about administering the vaccine. The question about the baby is a really good one. I'm not familiar with a lot of data in that regard, but I think, again, if you prevent the woman from having a severe case of COVID-19, you're protecting the baby in essence. And remember, this is classic, and I'm sure you've learned it in medical school. We heard from Dr. Barker that these vaccines are generating antibodies against the virus. And now that is something that would be transferred transplacentally, right, to the baby. We know that. So in a way, by immunizing the mother, and we know this from other diseases, you're immunizing the baby. And that can be a very positive outcome for the baby as well. That would be passively transferred antibodies. So like other vaccines, they're not going to stick around in perpetuity, but for a period of a few months, they will be around. So that's something else to consider as kind of a secondary benefit of vaccinating pregnant women. And that's, it's a rationale that you can take, for example, for why in the US we give Bordetella pertussis vaccines to pregnant women to make sure that their newborn has antibody against that particular bacterium. You could perhaps make that same argument here with COVID-19. We don't have, a lot of data in terms of real life scenarios to support that, but that's where I think you have to put whatever we know from what we've learned so far together with our understanding of what's likely to happen in medicine based on science. So I'll end there.
So that was fantastic. And a lot of really key points are all in that fabulous answer. So a couple of things that I will add on. And one of them is that at the beginning of the vaccine trials, they did not include women who were already pregnant. However, a number of women became pregnant while they were in the vaccine trials. And there were no adverse events seen in those women or in those pregnancies. And so while there was not a specific study looking at pregnant women, by chance, some women became pregnant who were in those studies, and they were fine. Their babies were fine from everything that we can see. And Robin mentioned that there is some evidence potentially, or there's some idea of antibodies being transferred transplacentally. There is actually a paper that just came out showing that antibodies coming from the vaccine can also be transmitted by breastfeeding. And so a vaccinated mother would also be able to transfer some antibodies to her baby in that way after the baby is born. Given the way that these vaccines work, it's not, there's no reason to expect that the mRNA or the DNA will be around in the cells long term, or will be in any cells outside of the cells in the arm that are getting the vaccine. And so we wouldn't expect those to influence the mother or the baby in that way. There are some stories online. I don't know if they've made it to you all in El Salvador, and I am just going to hope that they haven't, because it would make me sad to think otherwise, on the internet about some other issues with fertility. There was, and so I'm going to tell you the sort of the full evidence or the full story on this to help you understand how good or not good at all the evidence is here, which is that someone actually wrote a blog post that came up with a hypothesis that said, I think that the spike protein that is made by these vaccines is similar to a protein that's involved in the placenta called syncytin. So they didn't actually, this wasn't a peer-reviewed scientific paper. This wasn't part of the medical literature. This was in a blog post. And their evidence that they were similar and that perhaps if you made an immune response against spike, you would make an immune response against this protein in the placenta, syncytin, was that they had 4 amino acids in common. One thing I told my students is that that is far too few for you to have any kind of immune cross-reactivity. That is not the type of evidence, and there was no actual scientific evidence shown here. It was just sort of someone hypothesizing. If I tell my students that if you were to look at my writing and Shakespeare's writing, you would find places where we have 4 words in a row that are the same, and no one's going to confuse me for Shakespeare. So it's sort of a by chance, yes, there are 4 amino acids in common. That is not enough to induce any immune responses. And that sort of got taken out of control as something that could lead to problems in women's fertility, but there is in fact no evidence of that. The best evidence we have is of those women who got pregnant during the vaccine trials who have healthy babies now.
If I could jump in, that was absolutely fabulous because it hits on something that I think we've all been thinking about a lot during this pandemic, and that is what do we know to be true and what do we know to not be true? And the fact of the matter is we're learning as we go, and we're applying science and we're trying to do the best job we can. We don't have all the answers, but you hear a story like that, and what we can say is that story does not make any sense. That can't possibly be true. That's what you heard. And yet, we know that fertility is a touchy subject, right, for women. And you're thinking about presumably younger women having concerns about, taking a vaccine that doesn't have a long track record, that truly hasn't been studied for years and years and years, which is probably what you'd need to address effects on fertility realistically. And you can see where the concern comes up. But then you look at that science and that's crazy, right? That makes absolutely no sense. And I also think, I can't think of an example of a vaccine that impacts fertility. So even the concept, right? Like the question doesn't even make sense to me in the first place. Like, how do you even get to this question? I'm not sure that in clinical trials of vaccines, fertility is a safety endpoint and any of these trials, and you might say, oh my goodness, it should be, but why? Does that make any sense to you as medical doctors in training that a vaccine, and any vaccine, maybe a live vaccine that would somehow track to exactly the right spot? I'm making this up. I can't even imagine how this would happen. The question doesn't even make any sense, and yet, it is something new. We don't have a track record, so it's true that as scientists, as medical doctors, we can't say for sure that after 20 years of experience with this vaccine, we're sure there's no effect on fertility. So that makes it hard too. But look at the evidence; it makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah, totally agree, and thank you so much for pointing this out. I guess many people of our audience had this question, and it's because of the media and everything. Actually, everything's new, so many people have doubts about it, and some others have their fears about the vaccines. So continuing, that's why we have this discussion to make it clear any question that the audience and including us we have. So the next question is about why the average age of the vaccination. We also would like to know, and if both of you can make it clear to the entire audience, the importance of the age range in which vaccines are applied. For example, Pfizer, which starts at 16 years, AstraZeneca and Moderna, which is the application starts from 18 years old. We would like the opinion of both of you about this, and since recent studies have shown also the importance of vaccination in adults, and the explanation to make it all clear why is there's an average of the age range. Dr. Patel, if you would like.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, first of all, this is a very good question. It's loaded with a number of other questions, such as who should get the vaccine and at what age should you vaccinate, right? But we have to go back to science. I mean, it's amazing how quickly these vaccines came out. And recall that generally speaking, there's an association with increased age and worse outcomes with COVID-19, but that doesn't mean that younger people aren't at risk for bad disease as well. It's not black and white like that, but there is this general association. And so, you know, if you're thinking about it as someone maybe in public health and you have limited vaccines, it's your older population that you likely want to target among the first to get the vaccine. And that certainly has been the case in the US and in other countries as well. But the reason for the age range at which the vaccines can be used really goes back to how they were studied. So when you set up a clinical trial, you define the patient population that you're studying. And that patient population may or may not be the patient population in whom you absolutely need the vaccine or don't need the vaccine, but you set up the study in a certain way and you choose what age group you're going to include. And we heard from Dr. Barker that pregnant women were not purposely included in those studies as well. You can understand why. With something, you know, brand new, absolutely no track record, that might not be the person you want to put in the study just right out of the gate. It makes sense. But as far as the age goes, you know, there was a certain age range that was studied, and that's what then goes through regulatory approval, and that's what the vaccines get approved for. And to extend the age range down, in this case, then there needs to be additional data in younger individuals showing that evidence that it's safe. I mean, we wouldn't really have a reason to believe it would necessarily be unsafe in younger individuals, but effective as well. And so we need to have some data that would support that. And that's forthcoming. And so we see the age kind of being dialed down, and we see different age ranges for different vaccines because of that. Recall too that when many of these vaccines started being developed, it was much earlier on in the pandemic. And I don't know if you remember, but there were questions about, you know, do kids get COVID-19? Is this really, you know, a concern that we would want to vaccinate this age group? And we certainly realized that it was the older age group we needed to target first, but we're now recognizing that, you know, there's a gap, and that is that we have a younger part of our population for which we don't have an approved vaccine. And so we need to get the age range sort of extended for the vaccine. If the question is, you know, does it make sense to vaccinate younger people for whom the vaccine is approved? I would say absolutely. I mean, I think everyone should be vaccinated. Everyone who can get the vaccine should be vaccinated against COVID-19. There's no doubt. We are in a crisis situation, a pandemic like none of us have really ever seen before, right? And we have one tool in medicine that can really make a difference, and that's vaccination, and we should use it.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have a question for you in response to that, because I think I am correct about this, but I'm not 100% positive. So in other vaccine trials, oftentimes we actually don't usually include the older population as well. And so here, the vaccine trial was done somewhat differently in that we knew that the older population perhaps was at some increased risk. And so we made sure to include them right away. So while there is this bottom age limit of either 16 or 18, depending on which company was making the vaccine and how they chose to do their trials, there is no maximum age. And that's actually, if I'm correct, that's not the way that this is usually done.
Yeah, I mean, it's an unusual virus too.
Right, yeah.
A lot of times, with vaccine preventable diseases, we think about kids. I mean, that's what I'm sure you guys learned in medical school. You think back to, measles and mumps and so forth. And these are typically diseases of childhood, polio and so forth. And so that's where we target our vaccines. But this has been an unusual virus in many, many ways. And the fact that it's a virus that preferentially affects older individuals, you might say that's a little bit like influenza, but influenza also affects younger individuals. We know that. And so it is interesting. And again, you have to go back to the beginning of the pandemic when these viruses were commissioned, if you will, the studies were set, and they weren't targeting the younger populations, but we know we need to go back and fill that void at this point. And that's happening. I think you're going to see some vaccine approvals very soon for younger individuals.
Yeah, I think that the vaccine approval for the 12 to 15-year-old age group, at least for Pfizer, is probably coming, I would guess, in the next week or so. Yeah. And I have been told that the 2 to 11-year-old age group, they are hoping to have approval by September for that group, which I have some friends with some young children who are counting down the minutes until their children can get vaccinated.
Okay, thank you. We appreciate your responses, and we are very clear now about that question. Well, let's continue with the next topic. It's about vaccine coverage against different strain mutations of SARS-CoV-2. As we know, genetic variants of SARS-CoV-2 have been emerging and circulating around the world throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. There is evidence that variants of concern like B.1.1.7, first detected in the United Kingdom, B.1 detected in Japan, Brazil, and B.1.351 detected in South Africa have impact on transmissibility, disease severity, diagnosis, treatment, and vaccines. Therefore, Dr. Barker, could you tell us which is the impact of new mutations of SARS-CoV-2 on the efficacy of the vaccines?
Sure, thanks. That's a great question. Lets me talk about all sorts of immunology that I really like. When your body makes an immune response to a virus, it is generally not making an immune response to one part of the virus. It is usually making a response to many epitopes within different antigens. And so you might make many different antibody specificities against that virus, many different T cell specificities against that virus. And that is also true with the vaccines that we have with SARS-CoV-2. They include only the spike information, but spike is a very large protein and has many different epitopes within it that can be recognized both by antibodies and by T cells. There is some evidence that some of the mutations in the new variants can reduce the ability of the antibody response to be effective against, say, one epitope out of all of the epitopes in spike. However, and that is a reduction. It doesn't mean that it's going to zero. So we're going from perhaps a very high level of antibodies to a medium level. It's not clear that the level is so low that they are ineffective, nor is it clear that all of the epitopes will be affected. Perhaps only one epitope or two epitopes might be affected. And so because you are making such a broad immune response, right now, there's no evidence that any of the variants can completely avoid immune responses. People have done more work looking at antibody responses than they have with T cell responses because the antibody experiments are a little easier to set up. But in the limited experiments they have done looking at T cell responses, it seems as though the T cell responses are not affected by these variants. And so the T cell responses seem to be fine. And so right now, particularly in individuals who have gotten, say, fully vaccinated 2 doses of their Pfizer and Moderna and have a nice high immune response. It seems as though the variants really don't have the ability to evade those vaccine-induced immune responses. The one caveat that you always have to say here is that as the virus has more chances to transmit from person to person and reproduce more, it could pick up more mutations. I have a hard time imagining a virus picking up so many mutations that it avoids every single epitope that the immune system is responding to, but I guess theoretically it could happen. And so that's one of the reasons why we want to get as many people vaccinated as possible, so we stop the virus's ability to make more mutations.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in, this is very reassuring and a wonderful immunologic explanation and reassurance about this situation. Practically speaking, we have the vaccines we have. It's our tool. We're medical doctors. We need to get people vaccinated, right? Because A, it's going to prevent them from getting sick. It probably is going to prevent them from getting sick with the variants of concern, which we just heard. It's going to stop the circulation of the virus. And we really don't have any other tools right now. So we have to keep an eye on this, right? Time will tell us. But to me, if the question is this a reason not to vaccinate, for example? No, it's not a reason not to vaccinate. So we continue, we vaccinate, and we continue to study the situation. We don't fully understand the epidemiology of this virus. We understand a lot more than we did, but we need to keep a close eye on it. Whether we're going to need to be revaccinated in the future to boost our immune response or to tweak it by addressing any of this, maybe not. We'll learn as we go. But right now we have vaccine, or you're getting vaccine. I understand you're getting more and more sort of over time. Encourage people to get it and roll it out and get it into their arms. That's the best thing that we can do to get this under control.
Thank you, both of you. Really, thank you. We now understand better, and this was a question that we were worried about, but we now understand more. Well, the next question. The risk of SARS-CoV-2 infection in fully vaccinated people cannot be completely eliminated as long as there is continued community transmissions of the virus. Vaccinated people could potentially still get COVID-19 and spread it to others. Then, Dr. Patel, we would like to know how the disease clinical presentation and prognosis changes once you are vaccinated.
Absolutely. So, this vaccine, we know from the clinical trials, is not 100% perfect, right? So you can still acquire the virus. We know that people can acquire the virus asymptomatically even without the vaccine. So certainly we know that can happen in vaccinated individuals. And we know that patients can become symptomatic as well. However, when I think about this virus, what's different with COVID-19 disease compared to maybe coronavirus disease caused by seasonal coronaviruses, which were circulating before this one arrived, are circulating much less right now, which is interesting to think about too. So the measures that we've put in place to control SARS-CoV-2 are controlling lots of other things. But honestly, I mean, you probably learned about seasonal coronaviruses in medical school, but we don't normally fuss about them. They cause a common cold, they are transmitted, they do make people sick, but they generally aren't causing people to become very sick, land up in the hospital, die, and so forth. So I think we have to think about, even if you can still pick up a mild case or an asymptomatic case less frequently, obviously, if you've been vaccinated. I mean, that's still a good thing. You're not getting severely ill from the virus, you're not being hospitalized, and you're not dying. Now, there still could be some spread, and the thing that concerns me is then we have kind of this mixed population right now where we have individuals who are vaccinated and individuals who aren't vaccinated. And so I'm not so much concerned for a big problem in the vaccinated population coming down with severe COVID-19 disease. But, you know, knowing that it can be transmitted, it just means to me that we need to get our population vaccinated because, you know, if the virus can circulate in people who are vaccinated to some extent, then they can serve as a vector to transmit it to the non-vaccinated and make them sick. So, you know, it's all true. The vaccines aren't perfect. Even if you look at the data from the vaccine trials, they didn't get rid of the possibility of people acquiring this virus. They decreased it significantly. And I think most importantly for me is a decrease in severe disease, hospitalization, death. Those are bad things. And that's what we're really concerned about with this virus. But again, what this tells me is let's get people vaccinated so we can stop this virus from circulating.
I was just going to again ask another question. Sorry, it was more of
Don't worry.
a quick question. So again, is it correct that at this point they're at having kind of no deaths in at least in the vaccine trial groups due to disease or due to COVID? So at least there they were saying, you know, 100% protection from death in those trials.
Correct. I mean, that's remarkable, right? And so that's when I pay attention to the statistics, that's the kind of thing that I'm paying attention to. Yeah, I guess it would be a beautiful thing if by getting vaccinated, there was no chance ever that you could pick up this virus. I'm not surprised about that. Think about influenza vaccination, right? That's not the perfect vaccine by any means, but it lessens the severity of disease significantly. And this is kind of very significantly, as Dr. Barker pointed out, the vaccine, to me, that's a high marker of efficacy, even if we know there could be still some asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic cases. And again, that's not even a common scenario with vaccinees.
Okay, thank you. We're going to pass to the third topic, which is vaccines and their side effects. The concern about the risk of side effects in the vaccines, right? Although the vaccine is it's the best hope to end the pandemic, and many population are alert about the side effects and they can create, right? Of course, this depends a lot on the origin of the vaccines, but because everything is practically new, and day by day, we see possible results. Dr. Patel, as an audience, we would like to know the more significant side effects and the most common up to date right now, and the ones that you have seen in your experience that are causing like this alarm in all the populations.
Yeah, very, very good question. And you pointed out that perhaps there are differences between the different vaccines. That's important to keep in mind here as well. You know, as a medical doctor, I think the perfect vaccine would be one that's 100% effective and has zero side effects, and probably also isn't a shot because people don't like needles. I mean, I'm just, you know, thinking out loud. But you know, what we saw with COVID-19 vaccines is amazingly fast development. You know, when I was answering questions to the media back in March of last year as ASM president, and, you know, people were asking about when will we have a vaccine? You know, I answered the question, you know, by saying, well, not before, you know, the end of the year. And I was thinking as I said that, yeah, I'm couching that in a not before because I don't even think it's going to happen by then. But at least I won't be wrong if I say it like that. And then it happened, right? Like pretty amazingly. That said, the technology that's being used in these vaccines is new. And they don't necessarily meet the mark for being the perfect vaccines in terms of lack of side effects. We have to be honest about that, right? But we are, again, we're in a pandemic. So I sort of, in my mind, I group side effects into, those that are pretty common, and you can look at the package inserts for the vaccines and you can see they'll list, all the side effects. And by the way, do take a look at the placebo side effects too, because that's always very interesting to look at, since they seem to happen in the placebo group as well. But look at them and you'll see there are pretty high rates of side effects in the day or two following receipt of some of the vaccines, like the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, for example. Especially after the second dose, a lot of people don't feel well. They may have some fever, they may have some discomfort in their arm, they may have headache, joint aches, and so on and so forth. You can read about all those side effects. If you've had the vaccine, you may have experienced some of those side effects yourself. And I wish that weren't the case, but we're not given a choice here today, right? And so I think those are, to me, they're fairly predictable that they're going to happen to a certain percentage of the population. And the good news is that, people recover and then they're fine and then they're immune. So that's great, that you just kind of deal with it. We wish they didn't have side effects. Then we have some very rare but unusual side effects of vaccines, like the thrombotic events that you've probably heard about and so forth. These are very rare side effects, and this is a difficult situation, I think, as for example, with the AstraZeneca vaccine, statistically, they're extraordinarily rare, but they do seem to be associated with the vaccine in the small number of people who have had these unusual side effects. So then it becomes a little bit more complicated, maybe, to think about. But if you think about it from a numbers perspective, the probability of having a severe vaccine reaction compared to having a severe outcome of COVID-19 is what you really have to weigh, right? This is a virus that's circulating and it's causing people to be very sick. And so that's what we're looking at. And, we don't have vaccines for everyone today, right, in the world. I wish we did. And I think it's maybe not fair that some places have more vaccine than others. That's a difficult conversation to have, but you can't be too picky about, well, I don't want that one, or I don't think I want it yet because I want more data. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so now's the time to get the vaccine and really benefit from that immunity that you're going to get from it, recognizing there's a high likelihood you might have some sort of side effects immediately, and a very, very rare possibility with some of the vaccines of some very unusual side effects that, I think compared to what you're dealing with COVID-19 are just, quite frankly, worth the risk.
So all of that's fantastic. I have one thing I kind of want to add, and I'm really only adding it because it is a question I have received many times. So one thing you may have heard, or perhaps not, is that some of the side effects that Dr. Patel mentions, like things like fever, are actually related to your immune system responding. And so it's actually incredibly difficult to design a vaccine that doesn't induce a little bit of those types of side effects, because you are trying to turn on your immune system. And so that's one thing to realize. There are some places where I think we have done a great job in telling everyone that message, because I have received quite a few questions from people who have said, well, I didn't have any side effects. Does that mean the vaccine failed in me? Does that mean it didn't work? What should I do? And My simple answer to that, because again, I'm getting this question all the time right now, is that your immune system has a lot of different cells and a lot of different parts. The part that we are usually hoping to have respond in a vaccine is not quite the same part that's usually associated with those fever types of side effects. And so if you have the fever side effects, that means you've engaged many arms of your immune system. But if you don't, that doesn't mean that the B cells and T cells aren't doing their job. It just doesn't mean that other piece of your immune system isn't as responding as strongly or to the point where you personally notice it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Dr. Barker and Dr. Patel. Well, the next question, ideally, it shouldn't be like a discussion, but in reality, it's something that most populations have it. So there are countries where people have more than one choice of vaccines, and is there like personal choice to have one or another? So as an expert, Dr. Barker, could you give us like the advice for this kind of patients that they will prefer one rather than the other one?
I think that I don't have a lot of reasons why a particular patient might want to prefer one versus another. And so my first thought would be you should get whichever vaccine is available to you, is number one, because we want to end this pandemic. Perhaps if you are in some of the age groups for whom the AstraZeneca vaccine has been a little bit controversial, maybe you want to get something else, but I would say get whichever vaccine is available to you.
And I completely agree. I have nothing to add to that.
Okay, great. So we're going to pass to the last question. Dr. Barker, how long will COVID-19 vaccine-induced immunity last?
So that is a question that I think we all would love to know the answer to. And it's a question that we probably won't know the answer to until we are able to study people who have received the vaccine for some period of time and actually see how long the vaccine induced immune response lasts. There is some data, particularly coming out from Moderna, that says the vaccine induced immune response still looks really good at 6 months, because that's how long they can look following the administration. And if you look at some of the sort of very broad aspects of the immune response that these vaccines are making, they look like immune responses to vaccines, which tend to give a good memory immune response. But in terms of giving any sort of specifics on this, that's the type of thing that we won't be able to really answer until we are able to study people who have received those vaccines over time.
Yeah, completely agree. It's like everything else with this pandemic, right? We need to ask the important questions, and your question is a really good one, because it's going to impact whether we need to revaccinate and when. And strategically in medicine, we're probably talking about, if that's the case, the whole world, right? That's a huge ask. But I think we need to ask it as a question rather than saying when, because we don't know the answer to this. And so we need to be generating the data. The patients in the vaccine trials were the first people to get the vaccine. So we do have some populations that can be followed. And now more and more people are getting the vaccine as well, so they can be followed. And so we learn as we go through this. And it makes sense for companies to be thinking about this possibility, but they can't know that we're going to need any more vaccine, and they certainly can't know when that would be. So it's complicated, right? From a science standpoint, you kind of need to keep working on it. You need to ask the question just in case, but we don't really know the answer for sure.
Okay, thank you. We as MicroS student chapter would like to thank you, Dr. Robin Patel and Dr. Brianne Barker, for all the knowledge that you share with us tonight. It was enriching and it's very appreciated by all of us. In this moment, we are going to ask you the questions from the audience. And if anyone wants to open their microphone, you are able to do it. So we have one here. Who might present an allergic reaction to the vaccine, and how severe can these allergic reactions be? Anyone could answer. Thank you.
So I think that the data that is out there on allergic reactions is largely that patients who've had severe anaphylaxis or severe allergic reactions in other settings, particularly with other vaccines, may be at risk and are given some extra monitoring. But I'm not sure that any patients outside of those presented with severe allergic reactions.
Yeah, and the other group might be in the 2-dose vaccine, someone who's had an allergic reaction to the first dose, right? Where that could be, and then with the second dose, that would be a concern. I think as far as a practical piece there, if you have somebody in whom you have concern, because we don't have a test to identify these people, but if you have someone who is concerned about it or for whom you're concerned, have them stay where they're getting the vaccine and monitor them for a period of time. And that's the best thing that you can do. It should make everybody feel comfortable when you do that.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, if there is a problem if someone gets the second dose of the vaccine, any of them, after the recommended time, or is something there?
So the timing is, again, like we mentioned before, set up based on how the vaccine trials were done. And the vaccine trials were done with some timing that would give us protection as soon as possible. And that would give us an answer to the trial as soon as possible. It was not necessarily done that 4 weeks was the perfect time for that. I could imagine that being slightly later might be okay, might lead to some okay immune responses. And so if a patient can't get that second dose at the right timing, they should make sure to get that second dose as soon as they can. It is probably not going to ruin everything if they are not able to meet the timing precisely.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's an interesting scenario where the way we use things is really just because of the way the clinical trials were set. I mean, we addressed that with the age question, and then the timing between dose question is the same piece and the same answer. But for you guys in medical school, this is basically like all of medicine. Like, why do we give X days of drug Y? That's just because somebody chose that number of days to study, and that's what we do. And so you always should ask questions about these points, because sometimes there might be an option that's better. I mean, I don't know whether 6 weeks might be better than 3 or 4. Please don't write down that I just said to give 6 weeks. I don't mean it that way, but you can question it. And I would say that for vaccines, what I normally teach is that if it's a multi-dose vaccine series, you should take it on the cadence that you're supposed to be taking it on. But if you're delayed, just catch yourself up and continue. And so there are some places that don't have enough vaccine to give the 2 vaccines at the interval in which they were studied. That's okay. People will get them later. It's probably fine. We don't have any reason to think it's not fine. We just, never studied them that way.
Okay, thank you for that. Just to make clear this, because we have these questions 2 times. Okay, like the influenza vaccine, should the COVID-19 vaccine be administered annually? If so, should the entire population be vaccinated again, or only populations at risk?
So that's a great question. So with the influenza vaccine, the reason why we are getting vaccinated each year is because there is some genetic change in the virus. And so you are getting a different vaccine each year to match the circulating version of the virus. Right now, we don't maybe think that the same kind of genetic change is happening, or at least the same mechanism of genetic change isn't happening here. And so it seems likely that the one vaccine right now will protect against many of the variants. And so here it's a slightly different question than it is for the influenza vaccine. For the influenza vaccine, you're getting vaccinated each year because the virus is changing. If we need to vaccinate with the COVID-19 vaccine annually or with some frequency, it will be because the immune response isn't lasting very long, and we don't know how long it will last yet. So it's hard to fully answer that question.
Yeah, and you can think about other vaccines that kind of follow that suit in medicine. Tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, we have vaccines that we give boosters to boost immunity, not because the microorganism has changed, but just because our immunity wanes over time. But we also have vaccines that we don't boost because immunity lasts a very long time and we think we don't need to boost them, or we've learned that we don't need to boost them. So I think it's a wait and see point at this juncture with COVID-19. We need to let time pass so we can actually answer this question. And I'm really reassured by Dr. Barker, our expert immunologist, kind of convincing us that maybe it won't be the same situation as influenza, where we have an evolving virus and we need to target variants. That would be great. So then we'd just be left with waning immunity. And I mean, I would think it wouldn't be a year, but we don't really know that, right? And we don't know what's ahead of us with this virus as well. But the good thing is we appear to have figured out how to act and how to make vaccines very quickly, right? So I think that we, as the medical scientific community, can rise to the occasion of whatever it is happens down the road with this virus.
Thank you very much. Next, we have one of our participants that would like to ask a question, Andrea Lopez.
Yeah, well, hi, sorry to bother you. Just want to ask one question. It's like kind of personal. The thing is that I have lupus, right? So, and I'm taking like immunosuppressors and steroids right now. So they have a lot of doctors told me that I can't actually have the vaccine because I could have like side effects. But I don't know, like you were talking before about the like all the side effects, and that people that has any kind of disease like lupus, for example, they can have like the vaccine, but there's some doctors that have told me the other way, but I don't know why. Like if you could tell me, I don't know if it's because of the medicine that I'm taking right now or another thing.
Yeah, that's a tricky situation. As far as I understand it, that's not an absolute contraindication to the vaccine. As we talked about, there can be immunologic side effects. They're fairly frequent with some of the vaccines, and whether you'd be more likely or less likely to experience those is actually not clear to me. So I can see why there's controversy overall. I mean, I would still stand in favor of giving the vaccine, but you have to listen to your doctors as well. So you can see why there's controversy.
Yeah, I would agree completely. I think that this is a situation where, not being your personal physician and knowing kind of some of your personal health issues, it's really hard to comment. But from what I know, I would agree very much with what Dr. Patel said.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Andrea, and you, doctors. We're as far, and we have only one question left. What were the main strategies to develop a vaccine in so little time?
So there are a few things that are really important in our ability to develop the vaccine in such a short time. One of them is that we knew some things about other coronaviruses, particularly SARS and MERS coronavirus, that told us that the spike protein was going to be an important protein in terms of inducing immune responses. So we were able to take advantage of that past research. mRNA vaccines have been used for some other clinical trials since 2013. And we knew some things about how to make mRNA vaccines quite quickly. In fact, between the time when the sequence of the virus was put online and when the first prototype mRNA vaccine was made, I believe it was a span of 2 days. So we have a lot of our kind of basic science knowledge was able to be put into practice here. But the other big piece to this is honestly that we spent a lot of money on this process. And so in some other situations, we usually have to sort of try to get money for different stages of the vaccine trial process. And we put a lot of money into this in order to have it go quickly and in order to make these good vaccines. And we overlapped some of the steps that are usually done one after another. But in a lot of ways, the biggest answer was we spent a lot of money.
Yeah, I will agree with that. But I'll add that this really emphasizes the value in investing in science and the value of science. Because, you know, those of us in microbiology, well, we knew something was going to happen with a pandemic at some point, but I'm not sure any of us knew exactly what was going to happen or that it would have ended up like this. You know, people sort of look at us sometimes like we're the ones causing it. I'm just joking. We're not. But we came into this pandemic at a perfect time from a scientific standpoint, right? We understood what we needed to understand about coronaviruses from our experiences with MERS and SARS, but also just because of some basic science in coronavirology, if you will. It was also perfect timing in terms of where the vaccine science was. I will point out, because I spend most of my time on the diagnostic side, it was also a perfect time in terms of being able to quickly roll out diagnostic tests in the way that they were rolled out. Had this pandemic happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I don't know what would have happened. It would have been very different. And I reflect on that a lot, because you guys are in medical school and undoubtedly you'll see things that you weren't taught about in medical school. Microorganisms will cause diseases that you weren't taught about. And I think we were lucky, but like Dr. Barker said, you need to invest in science. We need to understand microbes. We need to position ourselves to be able to make vaccines and therapeutics. And we need to position ourselves to be able to make new vaccines and therapeutics, because that's really the only defense that we have against microbes when they emerge in unprecedented ways.
Okay, thank you. There's anyone who would like to make another question on the audience or comments? Well, okay, so this is how we finish our activity about the Vaccine Week of America. We had three webinars, and the third one. So thank you for all our participants, and we are going to send you the link to the assistance form, and the word that we are having tonight is virus, as in Spanish virus, virus. So, and well, thank you again, doctors, and we hope we will see you again in future events.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure.
Yes, thanks so much for having us. This is really wonderful.
Thank you, and have